Okay, so you want a deep dive into a case that just sends chills down your spine? The Marcellus Williams case. It's not just some legal thriller, though. This one really makes you question, like, the core of our justice system, DNA evidence, you name it, especially with the death penalty hanging over it all. We're talking about a man executed for the 98 murder of Felicia Gale, a reporter in Missouri. And these articles, man, they just bring up so many unsettling questions, you know?
Yeah, it's wild. Like this case, it really throws the whole idea of how we get justice, how messy it can be, right into the spotlight. And Williams's case, that's like the epitome of that.
So, to even begin to untangle this, let's rewind, right? Back to 98, St. Louis. Felicia Gale is found murdered in her own house, and it's brutal. We're talking 43 stab wounds. I mean, can you imagine the shockwaves? Especially with Gale being this well-respected journalist. What was the evidence against Williams initially?
So put yourself in that moment, right? Everyone wants answers. There's pressure to find Gale's killer. The prosecution, they present this story, and on the surface, it seemed, I don't know, almost too simple. They found stuff in Williams's car that belonged to Gale. Plus, someone claimed they bought a laptop from him, and guess what? Matched the description of hers.
So the jury's looking at this evidence about her stuff, right? But Gale, she wasn't just anybody. She was a journalist, a public figure. Her death hit differently, you know, like a blow to the whole community. How did that affect the trial, the whole vibe around it?
Oh, man, you can't overstate that. A crime like this, against someone in the public eye, it's like this collective need for someone to pay.
Yeah.
Just amplifies the desire for, well, justice to be served and quickly.
And that's what the jury decided, right? Williams was convicted in 2001, but here's the kicker. From the jump, he insisted he was innocent, never backed down.
And that right there becomes huge as time goes on. Because this story, it doesn't end with that guilty verdict, not even close.
This is where things go from kind of murky to like a whole different level of complicated. Years go by and boom, Touch DNA bursts onto the scene. Back in 98, that wasn't really a thing. And now suddenly it's like this whole new path opens up in the investigation.
Oh yeah, this wasn't just like a little upgrade or something. Touch DNA. That had the potential to completely change the game in forensics. We're talking finding evidence that was basically invisible before. And for Marcellus Williams, man, it threw the whole case into question.
Let me get this straight. When they finally tested the murder weapon with this new tech, it didn't actually directly point to Williams, right?
You got it. It wasn't like a clear-cut, he did it
Yeah.
kind of moment, which is what the prosecution, I'm sure, was hoping for. But, and this is the messed up part, it didn't rule him OUT either.
Yeah.
And to make it even worse, how they handled the evidence. Let's just say they made a complicated situation a whole lot worse.
We're talking about that whole contamination issue, aren't we?
Yeah.
This is where my brain starts to melt a little. Break it down for us, will you? What exactly went wrong, and how does it affect the whole DNA thing?
Okay, so picture it. The murder weapon, right? The knife, the whole shebang. It wasn't handled the way it should have been. I mean, the level of care it needed. You can dive into the nitty-gritty details in the articles, but basically, there were some serious slip-ups when they first got the evidence, how they stored it, you name it. And we're not talking small potatoes here. This messed with the entire DNA analysis. Big time.
It's like, you ever try to do one of those puzzles where someone swapped out half the pieces? Like, you kind of see the picture, but you also know it's totally wrong.
Nailed it.
Yeah.
And that's the problem. The contamination, it didn't magically make Williams innocent, but it casts this huge shadow over that evidence. Suddenly, that open and shut case the prosecution was so confident about back in '01, it starts to fall apart.
Okay, so we've got this already iffy DNA situation, right? But then, just when you thought it couldn't get crazier, we get a real bombshell. The St. Louis County Prosecutor's Office, the same folks who fought to convict Williams, they come out and say they support his innocence.
And they don't just say, oops, we made a mistake or something. They point to the fact that there's no solid forensic evidence, nothing that ties Williams to the crime scene, without a doubt.
So they're saying after all this time that they might have gotten it wrong.
Pretty much, yeah. And they don't stop there either. They start raising concerns about the jury selection, like maybe there was some bias there. I mean, that's almost unheard of, especially in a case this big. Don't forget, this isn't some theoretical thing. It's a man's life on the line.
So we're talking about contaminated evidence, the prosecution changing their tune completely. You'd think with all this doubt piling up, the case would have, I don't know, hit a wall. Did anything happen to, like, fix things?
You'd hope so, right? But it's not always that cut and dry. Williams and his lawyers, they had all this new info, and they went for it, man. Appeals, trying for a new trial, anything to stop, the worst from happening. Their whole thing was the DNA the big thing in the first trial. It was basically useless now. They even took it up to the Missouri Supreme Court.
And what happened? Did the Supreme Court, did they get, the seriousness of this whole thing?
Well, and this is a part that's tough to hear. The Missouri Supreme Court, they upheld the conviction, even with the prosecution basically saying, hold up, even with that messed up DNA, they wouldn't overturn it.
Man, that's rough. But there were other options, weren't there? Like clemency. Couldn't the governor step in?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
Governor Parson, he could have commuted the sentence, maybe life in prison instead, right? And this is where things take another crazy turn. Felicia Gale's family, the victim's family, they came forward and said they wanted life in prison for Williams, not the death penalty.
Wow. So even they, the people most affected by all this, they were against the execution. That says a lot, don't you think?
Yeah, no doubt. It shows that even in these situations, these heartbreaking, impossible situations, there's still room for, seeing the whole picture, for something besides just punishment. But even with that, with the family, with the doubts about the case, Governor Parson, he didn't grant clemency.
You mentioned something about a plea deal earlier. What was that all about?
Right. This is where that Alford plea comes in, and it's wild, honestly. Think about it. You're Marcellus Williams, you know you're innocent, but the system's basically got you backed into a corner, ready to punish you no matter what. So they offer this deal. He could still say he's innocent, but he admits they probably have enough to convict him anyway.
So like a way out of the death penalty, but he'd still be saying he didn't do it. That's a heavy decision.
No kidding. I mean, how do you even weigh that? And Williams, he decided not to take it. He stuck to his guns, said he was innocent right to the very end.
Which brings us to how this all ends. Tragically, Marcellus Williams was executed in 2024.
It's one of those cases that sticks with you, makes you think about the justice system in a whole different light.
That's for sure. This wasn't just about one case, one man, It's about the system we have, the one that's supposed to bring justice, and how it can get things wrong. It makes you wonder, are we so busy trying to get justice that we forget what it even means sometimes?
It's a good question. If the system can be flawed, if it can lead to irreversible consequences, how do we make it better? How do we make sure something like this never happens again?
This whole thing, man, more questions than answers, but maybe that's the point. This deep dive, if it taught us anything, it's that justice is complicated. And the conversations about it, they gotta be complicated too.